We're brewing a Sati style, a Finnish Sati. It's a Nordic beer that's centuries and centuries old. And also the techniques are very, very old if we wanted to go back to true technique. Basically none of this but the juniper would be here. Traditionally the brew itself would consist of a European like Pilsner malt of some level, usually some wooden malt or some white malts that have some color to them, not a ton of it, but it was truly dependent on what you could access at the time. But I'll add juniper, I think, in 3 phases. There's some in there now. I'll add some when we sparge, and then I'm going to add some at the end of the boil. So we're essentially using the mashed bed as a filtration / flavor enhancer with the boughs of juniper. And actually, a juniper berry is actually a cone, much like a hop, and it has preservative effects to it as well, just like hops do as well. And so you can start to smell the steam coming off as they basically sit down there, and that hot water is pushing through them, while the barley and mash is below it and is being transferred slowly into the oil kettle. In previous clips, we were talking about process with regards to kind of how a traditional Sati is built, it being a historical style, using very rudimentary type of methods to develop that flavor profile, and the offshoots that we were using to make it a little bit more modernized, so to speak. What we ended up with is I did use the juniper boughs in the Vorloff or the sparge, and then also during the whirlpool, hoping to pick up some of that juniper character. I wasn't exactly sure how much we would get off of it. By the end of it, I did have some aroma pulling, but it wasn't overwhelming by any means, which was kind of on purpose. We wanted to make sure that if it was hot side, we weren't getting too much bitterness or astringency from that, because that can be something that comes out of a juniper berry or something to that effect. Did a normal runoff and whirlpool, and then pitched at around 95 degrees. Our kveikis has been described in previous videos and is a traditional Norwegian strain. It fermented in around 48 hours. It actually moved quite rapidly at that high temperature, which is typical of that kveikis at a high temp. Did take some conditioning time. The initial tastes of it were a little bit on that astringent side, but very, very little like juniper character. So obviously right off you're like, oh, a little bit of a disappointment. Interestingly though, that next couple days, as it kind of conditioned down, we ended up with a lot more, I don't even know how to completely describe it, almost like a fruity tree-like flavor. That's very unusual to say, but it has some woodsiness to it. Brewer kind of described it as almost that raw oak or white oak, but then a ton of fruit that came from not only the juniper, but also the yeast. The kveikis provided a lot of that. The hopping rate on it is literally that much. There's very, very little hops in it because a traditional Sati has 0 hops, but we did want something in there. And then we just conditioned it after fermentation was complete at around 32 degrees for another 4 or 5 days before kegging it. It does have a little bit more haze to it, and it kind of stands up in that regard with the amount of wheat that we added in, that you wanted to have some of that kind of turbidity that comes from a traditional Sati. But aside from the other traditional things that we used, we kept that ABV super low for Ciao Summer at 4.5% or 4.4%, I believe. So very drinkable, but a lot of character coming out of it. So you'll notice that in the flavor, that you get fruit, you'll get that little woodsiness, you'll get the body of the wheat. You get that Munich malt that comes through, that's kind of that caramely flavor or crystal flavor that comes through, crystal malt flavor. It fulfills basically most the points of flavor that you want while still being a super sessionable Ciao Summer type of beer. So we're hoping it'll be good, and I think it should work really nicely with our lineup.
Oh yeah.
Ciao Summer.
Can I ask also, like, what made you sort of decide to move away from the Sati label versus just a field
Calling
beer?
it just a field beer, yeah. Obviously the flavor profile of a Sati does describe juniper or that gin-like characteristic quite a bit. And without that kind of being present, I didn't want folks coming into it saying Sati, seeing that label, and then assuming they're going to get that out of that, because you don't necessarily. Field beer is a category, and it can include just about anything you can forage almost. We just kind of thought about what kind of characteristics we were getting out of that flavor profile, and it kind of landed within that category. So finish this field beer. Cheers.
Cheers.